The green sun, Helgra burned green. The Forge World sky, once dignified gray from millennia of sacred pollution, now roiled with the sickly emerald of orc occupation. 3 months since the Way-Egg arrived. 3 months of brutal attrition as green-skinned forces overran manufactorums, corrupted sacred forge shrines, planted their crude banners atop humanity's monuments. Tech priest Dominus Vexar stood in Cathedral Forge Primus, the last imperial stronghold, and watched tactical overlays paint his world's death in clinical detail. Orc forces 2.7 million. Imperial defenders 47,000. Time until breach 4 hours. They had lost. Then every augur screen whited out simultaneously. The anomaly appeared at the system's edge, pure photonic emission, no mass, no warp signature. It moved with impossible acceleration, crossing distances that should have taken hours in mere minutes. Through armored viewports, even unaugmented eyes saw it a star falling with purpose. Impact. The northern sector, 300,000 orcs, dozens of war machines, an entire egg stronghold vaporized. A pillar of white gold light erupted so bright that Vexar's augmented optics failed. When the glare faded, new geography existed, molten slag cooling to glass metal vapor, condensing as glittering rain. At the crater's heart, a figure, standing, walking, human. Vexar magnified the image. Unremarkable stature, unmarked skin despite atmospheric entry, simple clothing that should have burned away. Copper hair catching light as if each strand generated its own illumination. The figure turned toward the twin suns and smiled. Gutkrusha the Immense was having the best day of his extremely violent life. The Humies had finally stopped running and started proper fighting, which meant more enemies to crush, more loot to take, more noise to make. His mega gargant, a walking fortress of guns and poorly understood physics, had just stomped through 3 city blocks. The buildings crunched satisfyingly. Then the sun fell from the sky. Even orcs possessed enough survival instinct to recognize existential threats. When the impact vaporized the northern front, including Gutkrusha's second favorite war boss and 300,000 boys, the celebration stopped. "What was that?" Gutkrusha bellowed from his command throne. His mech boy Sparkgit frantically adjusted dials that did nothing. "Boss Defingits, it's hot, real hot. I can see that you get." Gutkrusha focused his one good eye on the crater. Something was walking out of it, something small, a Humie. Gutkrusha laughed, the sound like metal tearing. "They sent one boy, one." He keyed the Vox to broadcast across his entire wag. "Get him, whoever brings me that Humie's head gets to ride on the Gargant." The response was immediate. Thousands of orcs from lowly Gretchen to massive knobs in mega armor surged toward the crater. Choppas raised shootas blazing ready for glorious violence. The stranger stopped walking. He looked at the approaching horde with an expression that Gutkrusha, even through kilometers of distance and augmented view screens, could somehow read perfectly. Disappointment. "It's cold," Escanor said to no one in particular. The planet's twin suns provided minimal warmth through the pollution. His internal clock, that instinctive awareness that had governed his entire existence, registered their light as barely adequate. Early morning, perhaps. Certainly not noon. He flexed his fingers experimentally. The power was there, coiled beneath his skin like a sleeping beast, but diminished, manageable, almost human. Almost. The ground beneath his feet had begun to glow, edges of his footprints turning orange with residual heat. Steam rose from his shoulders where atmosphere met his body temperature. He paid it no mind. Focused instead on the approaching mob. Green. Everything was green. The creature's orc something in his borrowed memories whispered, were green. Their vehicles were green. Even their enthusiasm seemed tinged with that particular shade of violent emerald. Escanor sighed. The sound carried surprising weight, rippling through the air like a stone through still water. The first wave reached him, 50 orcs on crude motorcycles, their engines bellowing smoke and defiance. They opened fire while still 100 meters out, bullets and las bolts converging on his position in a storm of metal and light. He didn't move. The rounds struck. Or rather, they reached the space where striking should have occurred, and then didn't. The air around Escanor had heated to the point of plasma formation, an invisible sphere of such extreme temperature that matter simply ceased following its expected trajectory. Bullets melted mid-flight, energy beams dispersed into harmless photons. The orcs, unable to stop their momentum, plunged into the sphere. They combusted, not burned combusted. The difference was technical but significant. These orcs simply transitioned from solid matter to constituent atoms, their molecular bonds breaking down in the face of heat that made fusion reactors seem tepid. Their bikes, more resilient thanks to orc technology's bizarre relationship with physics, lasted almost a full second longer before following their riders into thermal dissolution. Escanor watched this with the detached interest of someone observing weather. When the second wave came infantry, this time hundreds of them screaming their enthusiasm for violence, he finally moved. He took a step forward. The ground cracked beneath his foot, not from pressure, but from the sudden temperature differential. Glass formed in radiating lines, a spider web of crystallized earth spreading outward for 50 meters. The heat washed over the charging orcs like an ocean wave, stripping away bravado, and then consciousness, and then life with impartial efficiency. They fell in rows perfectly organized by their distance from him, creating concentric circles of corpses that would have been beautiful if not for their origin. Escanor took another step. "This is tiresome," he said softly. His words carried across the battlefield, somehow audible above the roar of engines and weapons, reaching orc ears with crystal clarity. The advance hesitated, not from fear. Orcs didn't really do fear, but from confusion. The Humi was just standing there, just walking, not doing any of the normal Humi things. Gutcrusher, watching through his view screens, felt something he'd never experienced before: doubt. The Rita lay where he'd left it. Escanor hadn't realized he'd brought it until his hand reached out and found the familiar weight. The divine axe materialized from nowhere, or perhaps had been there all along, waiting. Its surface caught the weak sunlight and amplified it, the metal heating from room temperature to white hot in the span of a breath. He lifted it one-handed, the motion casual despite the weapon's absurd mass. The mega gargant fired. Every weapon it possessed, and it possessed many, discharged simultaneously. Missiles, shells, las beams, some kind of green lightning that made the air scream. The barrage would have leveled a city block, erased. A fortress killed anything short of a titan. Escanor swung Rita. The axe moved through the air, and where it passed, reality bent. Not broke bent like light refracting through a prism. The incoming fire curved, following new trajectories that led anywhere except toward him. Missiles looped back toward their launchers. Las beams scattered into harmless rainbows. The green lightning earthed itself in the already melted ground. And then Rita completed its arc. The shockwave that followed wasn't wind or sound. It was displaced heat given kinetic form. A wall of atmospheric pressure moving at hypersonic speeds, carrying temperatures measured in millions of degrees. It crossed the kilometer distance to the mega gargant in less than a second. The Titan-sized war machine didn't explode. Explosions implied containment failure, rapid expansion, some element of mechanical cause and effect. The mega gargant simply ceased to be solid, its armor thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment sublimated. Its structure, held together by orc belief and spit, transitioned to gas. The crew inside achieved a brief state of plasma before their atomic structure voted for early dissolution. Where Gutcrusha's pride had stood, only a shadow remained, a dark mark on the ground, the only surface cool enough not to have been flash-burned into glass. Escanor lowered Rita, resting its head on the ground. The metal hissed, eating through rockcrete like acid through flesh. He looked at the remaining orc forces, thousands upon thousands of them, spreading across the hellscape his arrival had created. They stared back, their simple minds struggling to process what they'd witnessed. "Leave," Escanor said. His voice held no anger, no threat. It was a simple statement of fact delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who knew that his words would reshape reality to match his will. The orcs ran. Not a retreat, not a tactical withdrawal. They ran, dropping weapons, abandoning vehicles, fleeing with the mindless panic of prey that had finally recognized a predator beyond all classification. The way. That psychic field of collective violence that gave orc technology its impossible functionality shattered like glass under a hammer. Within minutes, the planet's surface was empty of greenskins, except for those who'd gotten flash-cooked in Escanor's initial demonstration. Tech Priest Vexar found him an hour later standing in the crater face toward the ascending suns. "Identify yourself." Escanor's glance overloaded Vexar's optical sensors, forcing him to rely on organic eyes. "I am the one who is here. You saved this world. I existed near it. The salvation was incidental." He watched the sky. "What time does the sun reach its peak?" "Local noon in 2 hours, 17 minutes. Something flickered across Escanor's face. Satisfaction, perhaps. "Good. That should be sufficient." "Sufficient for what?" Escanor didn't answer. He stood face tilted upward, body temperature rising. The ground glowed cherry red, then orange, then white hot. Vexar stepped back, thermal sensors screaming. "What are you—" Escanor looked at him fully. Those eyes, gold-burning, holding nothing of warpcraft or machinery, contained something that predated the Omnissiah's wisdom and the Emperor's vision. Pure, undiluted pride. "Watch," Escanor said, "and know that I am the sun's most devoted servant." Noon arrived. Later, when Mechanicus scholars attempted to calculate the energy release, their cogitators would experience logic failures. When Imperial cartographers tried to map the aftermath, their servo skulls would simply shut down rather than process the contradiction. When navigator houses briefed their seers on the Helgra incident, half would request immediate retirement, because at noon, Escanor became. Not transformed, became. The distinction mattered. Transformation implied change from one state to another. This was revelation of a state that had always existed, merely waiting for its appointed hour. His body expanded, growing to nearly twice its height, muscles developing with geometric precision. His hair blazed, each strand a filament of captured starlight. The casual clothes he wore burned away, replaced by heat itself, given form a corona of flame that served as both armor and declaration. And his shadow fell across the entire northern hemisphere. Vexar, watching from 3 kilometers away behind the cathedral's strongest void shields, saw the planet's curvature shift. Not from tectonic movement, but because the local spacetime had warped in response to the sheer concentration of energy manifesting in one location. Escanor raised Rita above his head with one hand. The axe, already monumentally heavy, had become something else, a fragment of stellar core, a piece of sun made manifest and weaponized. He brought it down. The swing itself lasted less than a second. The consequences would last for millennia. Helgra split, not metaphorically, not partially. The divine axe's edge struck the planet's surface and continued downward, cleaving through crust mantle core itself and emerging on the other side in a spray of molten nickel iron. The cut ran perfectly straight, guided not by physics, but by pure, inflexible will. For a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 30, time had become negotiable. The planet held its shape through momentum alone. The two halves continued their orbit, separated by a growing gulf of vacuum and superheated gas. Then the twin suns' gravity asserted itself. Each half fell into its own decaying orbit, beginning the long spiral toward solar immolation. But they fell slowly, gracefully, like leaves drifting from an autumn tree. The planet that had stood for 10,000 years as a monument to the Omnissiah's glory would die over the course of months, visible to all who entered the system as a warning and wonder both. Escanor lowered his arm. The exertion, if it could be called that, had not even quickened his breath. He looked at his work with the critical eye of an artist examining a painting. "Acceptable," he said. his voice amplified by the void and the heat shimmer of dying atmospheres carried across all Vox channels on every ship in the system. On Cathedral Forge, Primus now orbiting independently in the debris field, Vexar watched his world die and felt something his augmented mind couldn't quite process. Awe, perhaps, or terror, or the understanding that he'd witnessed divinity made tactical. The tech priest activated the general broadcast, knowing his words would be recorded, analyzed, entered into the Mechanicus archives for millennia to come. "By the Omnissiah's grace," he whispered, "we have seen the birth of a new star." As the hours passed and noon gave way to afternoon, Escanor's form diminished. The terrible radiance faded. The cosmic presence that had split a world withdrew back into human dimensions. By sunset, measured now by the system's primary star, as Helgra no longer had a surface to define such things, he had returned to the frail, diminished thing that had first appeared in the crater. A rescue shuttle found him floating in the debris field, curled in on himself, shivering despite the vacuum's inability to transmit cold. They brought him aboard, wrapped him in thermal blankets, tried to force nutrient paste down his throat. He waved them away weakly. "Just," his voice barely audible, "just let me see the sunrise tomorrow. That's all I ask." The crew exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to a being who'd just murdered a planet making such a simple request. The captain, a grizzled woman who'd seen 4 decades of void war, knelt beside him. "You'll see it," she promised. "Every day if you wish. The Imperium owes you that much." Escanor's eyes, no longer gold, just blue-tired human, met hers. "Thank you," he whispered. Then quieter still, "I'm sorry about your world." "You saved what mattered," the captain replied, though her voice shook. "The people, the knowledge, the rest was just metal and stone." Escanor closed his eyes, and for a moment looked like nothing more than what he'd claimed to be a man, lost, confused, impossibly far from home. "I wonder," he murmured, already drifting toward sleep, "if she would have been proud or disappointed. I can never tell which she'd prefer." The captain didn't ask who she was. Some questions she'd learned were better left unvoiced. From the dying world, Vexar's final transmission. "Today we witnessed impossibility. A man became son, then returned to man. We do not understand what he is. We do not know if he serves the Emperor's will or some purpose beyond our comprehension. But when darkness came, when we stood at extinction's threshold, light answered. Not the Astronomican's distant beacon, not the Emperor's holy radiance, but something other. Something that asked no permission, required no faith, demanded no worship. Light that simply was. May whoever wields this being remember, sons do not care what they illuminate. They burn regardless. Praise the Omnissiah, praise the Emperor, praise the Sun. The devourer of suns. The Valenti system was dying. Not quickly, the universe rarely afforded such mercies. 3 months ago, Valentis Prime had supported 17 billion souls across 5 inhabited worlds. Now the system's primary star flickered with unnatural rhythms, its light bleeding through spectrums that hurt to perceive. Hive Fleet Leviathan had arrived to feed. Captain Matthias Kane stood on the bridge of the Emperor's judgment, watching his homeworld disappear. Not explode, not burn, simply unmake itself layer by layer as bioships the size of continents stripped away atmosphere, ocean crust mantle. "Contact lost with Valentis Secundus," his sensor officer reported, voice flat. "Tertius shows 47% biomass consumption. Quartus is gone." Gone. 17 billion people reduced to a single word, every screen blanked white. Escanor had been drifting in a transit pod. The warp rejected him. Gellerfield simply stopped functioning in his presence. They had launched him like a torpedo toward wherever the Imperium needed a sun-shaped solution. In the darkness between stars, memories surfaced, her face mostly the way she'd looked at him, not with fear or worship, but curiosity. Scientific interest masking something deeper. Your power is fascinating, Escanor. The dichotomy. Two souls in one vessel cycling with the sun. The memory fractured. This wasn't his universe. These weren't his memories, or at least not entirely. But the essential truth remained: she'd seen him, truly seen him, and hadn't looked away. The pod sensors detected the fleet, and beyond it, something that made his borrowed instincts recoil. Hunger. Pure cosmic absolute hunger. When the hatch blew, Escanor emerged into vacuum and opened his eyes. Valentis Prime hung below him like a half-eaten fruit. Massive bioships clung to the surface like maggots on a wound feeding tubes, drawing up the dissolved remains of civilizations. Everywhere tyrannids, billions of them, an ocean of chitin and hunger. Escanor looked at the dying world, then at the two suns climbing toward zenith. Even hunger must learn to stop. He fell toward the swarm. The hive mind noticed him eventually, a point of light descending. Wrong temperature, wrong speed, wrong presence. It directed flyer strains to intercept. They combusted 3 kilometers out, flash-cooked by proximity alone. Recalculate. Harpy brood 30 organisms capable of shredding battle tanks. Escanor passed through them like a falling star through snow. Where he moved, air ignited. Harpy flesh liquefied. Their sonic screams died as vocal structures boiled away. Threat level significant. A hive tyrant rose to meet him, 30 meters tall, armored in living ceramite. It had killed dreadnoughts, torn apart battle tanks. Escanor landed on its head. The impact cratered the earth. The tyrant's skull cracked under his feet, chitin designed to withstand anti-tank rounds, shattering like porcelain. "You're hungry," Escanor observed, looking at the swarm flowing toward him like a living tide. "I understand hunger, but there's something you need to know." The swarm attacked. Gaunts in their thousands, warriors with bone swords, carnifexes that could break fortified walls. They reached 50 meters from Escanor and began to die. Not burn, die. Heat broke molecular bonds, severed synaptic connections, reduced complex organisms to component elements. They fell in perfect circles, marking the absolute boundary where life could not persist. The swarm adapted. Thermal-resistant carapaces advanced. Bioacid spitters launched streams. Biovores lobbed spore mines in high arcs. Escanor materialized Rita and swung once horizontal. The arc of displaced heat rolled outward like an invisible tsunami. A wave of temperature so extreme that air itself underwent fusion. The swarm in its path didn't have time to register death atoms, simply voted to exist in simpler configurations. Where millions had stood, silence remained. The hive mind escalated. Bioships descended. Warrior-class vessels kilometers long broke from feeding patterns and turned their attention downward, toward one man. Captain Kane watched his tactical display showing impossibility. The thermal readings suggest he's generating more energy than the system's stars, combined. A bioship fired a spore torpedo the size of a cathedral packed with acid-bathed genestealers. It streaked toward Escanor. He looked up at it. Just looked. The torpedo combusted mid-flight, its payload screaming before proteins unraveled. Another ship fired, then another. Dozens of projectiles converged on the point of light that refused to extinguish. Escanor planted Rita in the ground and raised his face to the sky. The suns had reached their apex. There existed a moment brief as a prayer where Escanor could choose to remain as he was. Small, manageable, human. He never chose that. His body expanded, muscles developing through pure will, each fiber a compression of stellar matter given flesh. His hair blazed a crown of solar flares. When he opened his eyes, they held no pupils, just light, pure and terrible. The One stood in full glory at local noon. The bioships unleashed everything. Bioplasma, acid torrents, living missiles, psychic screams, weapons that had scoured worlds and broken battle fleets. Escanor raised his hand. Divine spear. A beam of light lanced upward at speeds that made photons jealous, temperatures that fusion envied. The first bioship it touched ceased to exist, not destroyed, erased. The beam simply decided that matter was no longer welcome in that specific vector of space-time. The second ship attempted evasive action. Biology moved fast, evolved for speed. It wasn't fast enough. The beam adjusted tracking with lazy precision and connected. Another erasure. The third ship tried to retreat. The beam passed through its spores the ship itself and the fragment of hive mind directing operations. The psychic backlash rippled across the system. Tyranids by the billions lost coordination, synchronized movements collapsing into chaos. 23 bioships had entered atmosphere. 4 remained fleeing at speeds that would crack their own carapaces. Escanor let them go. Even predators deserved to carry warnings home. The ground beneath him had become a lake of liquid rock. He stood at its center, looking at the devastation with an expression that held only weariness. Is this enough? Is this what you wanted to see? The sky offered no answer. The Hive Fleet's response came within the hour. Not through ships it had learned that lesson. Instead, it did what Tyranids did best: it adapted. The remaining organisms on Valenti's prime surface began to change their bodies, twisting into new configurations. Thermal-resistant plating grew across carapaces. Reflective membranes developed to bounce directed heat. Biological venting systems to shed excess temperature. And they came again, this vast tide of hunger, given purpose, moving with the patient certainty of evolution itself. Escanor waited for them. His power had not diminished. Noon's blessing lasted longer than most, realized a grace period measured in hours rather than minutes. But something else had changed. The swarm approached differently now, with less fury and more calculation. Testing him, probing for weakness, they found none. For 3 hours they tried, wave after wave, each one more specialized than the last. Creatures that burrowed underground, trying to attack from below, they boiled alive before reaching him. Superheated earth cooking them in their tunnels. Flying strains that attempted altitude attacks, they rained down as ash. Psychic organisms that tried to assault his mind, they simply bounced off, finding no purchase in a consciousness too straightforward, too absolute in its self-definition to be swayed. The hive mind, for perhaps the first time in its existence, experienced something adjacent to frustration. Then the sun began to set. Escanor felt it immediately, the slow decline, the ebbing of that vast power that had defined him for hours. His body began to shrink, muscles compressing back to human proportions. The terrible heat radiating from his skin cooled to merely unbearable levels. The hive mind noticed too. It sent its reserved forces, everything it had held back, every organism too precious to waste on testing, every strain evolved for killing the unkillable. Hive tyrants in coordinated packs, Trigon primes that had consumed space marine librarians, a Tyrannofex whose acid could melt plasteel in seconds. They came at dusk when Escanor's power had faded to embers. He raised Rita, now heavy, so heavy he needed both hands, and smiled. Small, sad, human. Just a bit longer, he whispered to the axe or himself or the memory of someone who wasn't here. I can hold on just a bit longer. The first tyrant reached him. Its bone swords, each one capable of cleaving through Terminator armor, descended toward his head. Escanor moved, not with his earlier supernatural speed, but with the simple, brutal efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime fighting stronger than himself and learned to win anyway. He ducked under the swing, pivoted, brought Rita up in an arc that caught the tyrant under its jaw. The axe even diminished, still burned hot enough to split the creature's head open. But the effort cost him. He felt it in his muscles, the strain of moving weapon and body health. Another tyrant from the side. He blocked its strike with Rita's haft, but the impact drove him to one knee. A third attacked from behind. He couldn't turn in time. The bolt shell took it in the chest. Escanor blinked confused and looked up to see Imperial dropships descending like metal angels. Marines in power armor guard regiments. Even a knight, a small one barely 15 meters tall, but still a titan of war, crashing through the swarm with chainswords and faith. "We've got you," a voice crackled over external speakers. "Fall back. We'll cover your retreat." Escanor almost laughed. They thought he needed saving. These brave, foolish humans throwing themselves against the swarm to rescue someone who'd killed planets and broken fleets. The sheer audacity of it touched something deep in his fading power. "No," he said, though they couldn't hear him. "Not yet. I haven't finished." He planted Rita in the ground and reached inside himself past the exhaustion, past the natural limits of his borrowed flesh to the core where his true power resided. It hurt, he'd known it would hurt, but pain was just another form of sensation, and sensation meant he still lived. The sun touched the horizon, its last rays painting the devastated world in shades of amber and gold. Escanor drew those rays into himself, every photon, every joule of energy pulling them down, like a man drowning might pull at water. His body began to glow again, not with the terrible radiance of noon, but something softer, warmer, final. "One last time," he murmured. He became light, not metaphorically. His physical form dissolved into pure photonic energy, dispersing across the battlefield like dawn breaking. The Tyranids that his light touched simply stopped, their bodies intact but lifeless, as if the spark that animated them had been gently extinguished. The swarm, vast as it was, could not fight something that existed in every direction simultaneously. Within minutes, Valentis Prime fell silent. Within an hour, the Hive fleet, its ground forces obliterated, its command structures severed, began its retreat. The hive mind calculated losses, deemed the system more trouble than it was worth, and moved on to softer prey. It left behind a planet scoured of life, its surface glassed, its oceans boiled away. And at the center of the largest crater, a small pile of ash that might once have been a man. Captain Kane found him 3 days later. Not dead, somehow, impossibly not dead. The ash had reformed into flesh during the intervening nights, each sunset rebuilding what the last dawn had burned away. When they dug him out, he was curled in fetal position, breathing in shallow gasps, skin so pale it seemed translucent. "Water," Escanor croaked. His first word in 72 hours. They gave him water, then nutrient paste, then watched in amazement as he forced himself to sit up, every movement clearly agonizing, and looked at the devastated world around him. "I'm sorry," he said unprompted. "I tried to save it." Kane knelt beside him. "You saved the system. The other worlds, the fleet, 17 million souls that would have been consumed. You saved all of it. But not this one." Escanor touched the dead earth, his fingers coming away dusty with ash. "I was supposed to be better than this. She always said I could be better." "Who?" Kane asked gently. Escanor's eyes, blue again, so terribly human, held something that might have been memory or might have been delusion. Someone who understood that power without wisdom is just another form of hunger. He coughed, and his breath misted in the cold of the dead world. "Even hunger must learn to stop. I told them that. I should have listened to my own words." The rescue team wanted to move him immediately, get him to medical facilities. But Kane held up a hand. He recognized this moment, the aftermath of battle, when the violence fades and guilt floods in to fill the space. He'd seen it in soldiers, seen it in himself. Never thought he'd see it in something that could split worlds. "The Tyranids don't stop," Kane said quietly. "They feed until nothing remains. You stop them. Whatever it cost whoever you were trying to be, you stop them." Escanor closed his eyes. For a long moment he didn't respond. Then, barely audible, "Does that make it worth it? The burning?" Kane looked at the dead world, thought of the living ones beyond, and gave the only answer he could. "Ask the 17 million who still draw breath." Recorded observation, Magos biologist Drusus Vane, designated document Theta 7, classification Vermilion. Penalty for unauthorized access, immediate execution, no trial. Subject designated Saint Solar has exhibited previously undocumented capability, matter to energy conversion at will. Analysis of Valentis Prime crater residue suggests complete molecular disassociation, followed by reconstruction using ambient stellar radiation as template. This defies every principle of biology and physics. The energy required to maintain consciousness during photonic state would exceed a star's daily output. Yet evidence remains incontrovertible. More troubling subject appears unaware of the theological implications. When asked if this was resurrection, he looked confused and said, "No, I just hadn't set yet," as if dying and reforming was equivalent to a sun's day cycle. Recommendation: under no circumstances should this being be deployed near populated worlds during solar peak. The collateral damage potential exceeds Exterminatus-class weapons. Alternative recommendation: deploy exclusively against Exterminatus-level threats. If worlds must burn, let them burn in service of humanity's survival. The Emperor protects. We merely direct his light toward our enemies. They took him to a medical ship, strapped him to a bed designed for injured Astartes, the only furniture strong enough when his temperature fluctuated. For 2 weeks he slept, waking only at dawn to watch the sun rise through the viewport. On the 15th day, he finally spoke more than monosyllables. "I dreamed," he told the medici servitor attending him, though it couldn't understand. "I dreamed she was disappointed. Not angry, just sad. She said I'd forgotten what it meant to be small." The servitor, programmed only for basic responses, offered, "Patient shows signs of trauma. Recommend psyche evaluation." Escanor laughed a sound like breaking glass. "I destroyed a planet trying to save it. I think trauma is an insufficient diagnosis." At sunset, his body diminished to its weakest state. The medici restraints designed to hold enhanced humans hung loose on his wrists. He could have left any time. Instead, he stayed watching the stars through the viewport, counting systems he'd never see, the worlds he'd never walk. "Somewhere," he whispered to the darkness, "there's a sun rising. Someone is seeing light for the first time today. That has to matter. It has to." The darkness, being darkness, made no reply, but somewhere in his chest, where human hearts beat out their mortal rhythms, something that was neither organ nor emotion stirred. Pride, perhaps, or hope, or the terrible understanding that he would burn again and again and again until there was nothing left to burn. Because that's what suns did. They burned regardless. The sun over the tomb world. The warp spat him out like poison. Escanor's transit pod tumbled through real space alarms, screaming warnings about catastrophic trajectory failure. Through the viewport, he glimpsed his destination, a world of metal and silence, its surface polished to mirror perfection, reflecting starlight like a coin spinning in the void. No atmosphere, no rotation, no life, just geometry and death waiting. The pod struck surface at terminal velocity. Metal screamed against metal. The sound rang, too pure, too resonant, like a bell forged in a tomb. When the hatch blew, Escanor stumbled out into absolute cold. Zethera. The Mechanicus charts had called it a tomb world designation, Omega class. Do not approach, do not scan, do not wake what sleeps. He stood on a plain of silver that stretched to every horizon, perfectly flat, marked only by obelisks that rose like accusing fingers toward a black sky. Each one bore hieroglyphs that seemed to shift when he looked away, telling stories in a language older than human speech. The cold bit deeper than vacuum should allow. Not the absence of heat, but something that predated temperature itself. Entropy made architectural. Escanor breathed out and his breath crystallized mid-air. Tiny diamonds falling soundlessly to the metal ground. "Even here," he said to the silence, "the sun should shine." The silence disagreed. In the darkness beneath the surface, ancient machinery stirred. The Necrons had slept for 60 million years, dreaming metallic dreams of empires lost and flesh surrendered. Their tomb world had weathered the rise and fall of 1,000 lesser species, patient as stone waiting for a galaxy empty enough to reclaim. Then heat touched their sensors. Organic heat, life heat, impossible. Nothing lived on Zethera. The protocols were absolute. Deeper in the crypt, a Necron overlord's consciousness flickered into awareness. Lord Zondrek, once a general of flesh and blood, now a mind imprisoned in living metal, parsed the data with the cold logic of the undying. Temperature signature stellar adjacent, power output exceeding tolerance parameters, biological confirmed, contradiction. Biological entities could not generate stellar heat, yet the sensors insisted. Zandrek activated the tomb's defensive protocols. Throughout the crypt, millions of Necron warriors began their resurrection sequence, metal limbs jerking into motion, empty eye sockets kindling with emerald fire, weapons powering on after eons of dormancy. They would investigate. Then, depending on what they found, they would kill it, or try to. Escanor felt them before he saw them. A vibration through the metal beneath his feet, rhythmic as a heartbeat growing stronger. Then the ground opened, not broke, but dilated panels sliding aside with geometric precision to reveal shafts leading down into green-lit depths. They rose like a tide of silver and jade. Necron warriors rank upon rank moving in perfect synchronization, Gauss flares held at identical angles, steps timed to the microsecond, an army that didn't march so much as manifest emerging from the tomb with the inevitability of mathematics. Escanor counted them out of habit. 500, 1,000, 5,000. They kept coming, filling the plain with bodies that had forgotten how to die because they'd forgotten how to live. They formed a circle around him, 3 deep weapons trained inward, waiting. A larger figure emerged from the central shaft, humanoid in shape but twice human height, its frame ornate with the trappings of rank. Jade scarabs crawled across its chest piece. A staff topped with crackling energy hummed in its grip. The Overlord regarded Escanor with eyes that held no curiosity, no malice, no recognition that he qualified as anything more than an anomaly to be processed. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of glaciers grinding continents to dust. Identify, purpose, departure timeline. 3 questions, 3 opportunities to answer correctly and leave. Escanor looked at the undying thing before him, then at the thousands of undying things surrounding him, and felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, he'd left fear behind in another universe, but something adjacent to pity. "I have no name you would recognize," he said quietly. "My purpose is to exist, and I will depart when the sun sets." The Overlord processed this. Insufficient data, insufficient compliance. Organics do not survive tomb world surface conditions. Thermal regulation failure occurs within 3 solar rotations. Tissue degradation follows. You are already dead. You simply do not yet acknowledge termination. Escanor smiled, small and sad. "I've been dead before. It didn't take." The Overlord tilted its head, a gesture that might have been confusion or might have been targeting calculation. "Clarify." "No." For the first time in 60 million years, Lord Zandrek experienced something approximating uncertainty. The organic's thermal output continued to climb despite exposure to void-cold metal. Its biological signature remained stable despite the absence of atmosphere. It smiled in the face of 5,000 Gauss weapons as if they were garden ornaments. Unacceptable. Terminate the anomaly. 5,000 weapons fired as one. Escanor raised his hand. The Gauss beam, streams of flayed atoms that could strip flesh from bone and bone from existence, struck the air around him and scattered. Not deflected, not absorbed. Scattered like light through a prism, breaking into harmless component particles that danced away into the void. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. The heat radiating from his skin had simply grown intense enough that matter disintegration beams lost coherence before reaching their target. The Necrons fired again, and again. A sustained barrage that would have reduced an Imperial Titan to its constituent atoms. Escanor stood in the center of a pillar of green light, untouched, waiting for them to understand. They didn't stop. They were machines. Machines don't understand futility. They only recognize parameters met or parameters failed. Escanor sighed. The sound carried surprising weight, rippling through the metal plane like a stone through still water. "I tried to be gentle," he said. He took a step forward. The metal beneath his foot didn't melt, it transitioned, solid to liquid to gas to plasma in the span of a heartbeat. The shockwave of sudden state change rippled outward, a circle of pure thermal force expanding at hypersonic speed. The nearest ring of Necron warriors vanished, not destroyed, sublimated. Living metal designed to withstand atomic fire simply couldn't accommodate temperatures that exceeded stellar cores. Their bodies flashed to vapor, then to ionized particles, then to nothing at all. The second ring fared no better. The third began to teleport away, their phase-out protocols engaging, but heat moved faster than even their ancient technology. They dispersed mid-transit, scattered across dimensions they'd never reach. Escanor took another step. The Overlord watched its army evaporate and experienced something it hadn't felt since surrendering its flesh doubt. This wasn't battle. This was physics asserting dominance over engineering. It raised its staff, channeling the power of a captive star god shard. Energy lanced out, not Gauss, but something older, something that unmade reality itself on a quantum level. The beam struck Escanor's chest. He looked down at it, curious, as if noticing an insect. The reality unmaking energy washed over him like water over stone, present acknowledged irrelevant. "Your technology is impressive," Escanor said, his voice carrying easily across the metal plane, despite the lack of atmosphere. "But you build with what you know. I am what I am." He reached out and touched the beam. Light met light, and one of them remembered it had been born from a sun, while the other had merely stolen solar power and called it mastery. The Overlord's staff cracked ancient circuits, overloading the star god shard within, screaming silently as it recognized something from the universe before the universe. Escanor closed his hand and the beam extinguished. "I don't want to fight you," he said, and meant it. "You've already lost everything, your flesh, your lives, even your deaths. Taking what remains would be cruelty." The Overlord stared at him with eyes that had seen galaxies rise and fall. "We do not die." "No," Escanor agreed softly. "You don't. That's the tragedy." Deep beneath the surface in the crypt's central chamber, something woke that should have slept forever. The Satan Shard. A fragment of a star god imprisoned and weaponized by the Necrons eons ago felt the heat signature above and remembered. Remembered when stars were young and wild. Remembered feeding on stellar matter before lesser beings learned to trap and bind. Remembered hunger. Its cage opened. Not by command, the Necrons would never willingly release their captive god. It opened because the locks were melting, ancient mechanisms failing as heat seeped down through kilometers of metal to touch even the deepest chambers. The Satan rose, a being of pure energy barely constrained by a vaguely humanoid form. It flowed upward through the tomb like mercury rising in a thermometer phase, shifting through solid matter as if solidity were a polite suggestion. When it emerged onto the surface, the metal plane cracked not from force, but from its mere presence, reality bending under the weight of something that predated physical law. The Satan looked at Escanor. Escanor looked back. For a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 3 centuries, time bent strange around star gods, neither moved. They simply regarded each other, the imprisoned fragment of cosmic divinity and the man who carried a son's heart in mortal flesh. The Satan spoke, its voice like solar winds given language. "You are not Necron. No. You are not Ketan. No. Yet you burn with stellar fire." Escanor glanced up at the sky where distant stars flickered like candles in a cathedral. The nearest sun was hours away by transit, but he could feel it pulling at something deep in his core, calling him to wake, to rise, to become. He looked back at the Satan. "I'm just someone who was told to stand here. So I'm standing." The star god tilted its head, a gesture it had learned from the flesh beings it once consumed. Flesh cannot contain solar fire. You should not exist. A ghost of a smile touched Escanor's lips. "I get that a lot." The Satan attacked. Not with weapons. Star gods didn't need weapons. It simply exerted will, reaching out to unmake Escanor on a fundamental level, to scatter his atoms across the solar system, to erase the contradiction he represented. Reality around Escanor began to fray. The metal beneath his feet lost cohesion. The void above forgot how to be empty. Existence itself started voting on whether he was allowed to continue. He felt it, the pull toward non-being, the invitation to simply stop. He declined. "No," Escanor said, and the word carried weight that surprised even him. "I'm not done yet." His body began to glow. Not gradually, suddenly, terribly, a switch thrown from darkness to incandescence. The transformation that usually took hours compressed into heartbeats. The one emerged. Later, Mechanicus scholars would debate whether the Zythera event qualified as a battle or a mutual annihilation. The sensor data was contradictory. Two stellar-level energy signatures overlapping, thermal readings that exceeded the melting point of reality, gravitational fluctuations suggesting local space-time collapse. Then silence, empty space where a planet had been. Not destroyed, unwritten, edited out of existence by forces that refused to acknowledge each other's right to occupy the same universe. A single Necron escape vessel fleeing at maximum velocity carried Lord Xandrek and 47 warriors, the sole survivors of Tomb World Zythera. Their after-action report was brief. Encountered solar phenomenon in biological shell. Planet compromised. Recommend avoid star carriers at all costs. No victory condition exists. The report ended there. But in the private logs accessible only to Necron overlords, Xandrek added one more line. "For the first time since biotransference, I remembered what it felt like to be warm. I do not think I shall forget again." They found Escanor drifting in the debris field 3 days later. His body had cooled to near baseline human temperature, barely distinguishable from a corpse. But when they pulled him aboard the salvage ship, his eyes opened, blue, exhausted, utterly human. "Did I win?" he asked, voice barely audible. The salvage captain, a woman who'd seen 30 years of void war, looked at the space where a planet used to be. "There's nothing left to win against," she said carefully. Escanor closed his eyes. "That's not the same thing." They wrapped him in thermal blankets, tried to feed him, watched as he drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, delirious from exhaustion, he spoke to someone who wasn't there. "I know you'd say this was excessive," he murmured. "I know. But they didn't understand that some things should stay dead, not because they're evil, just because rest is a gift, and they threw it away." His hand clenched around empty air as if holding something precious. "Would you have done it differently? Would you have found the kind solution, the one I couldn't see?" The empty air offered no answer. "I thought not," he whispered, and something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob escaped him. "We were always better at burning than building, weren't we?" The salvage crew pretended not to hear. Some conversations were too private to acknowledge even when spoken aloud. When dawn came, marked by the ship's chrono rather than any actual sun, Escanor woke fully. He sat up, looked at his hands as if surprised to find them still attached, and asked for water. "Where am I going next?" he asked after drinking. The captain hesitated. "You're not. You're going to a medical facility. Extended observation. Possible retirement." Escanor shook his head, the gesture surprisingly firm for someone who'd obliterated a planet 3 days prior. "No. There's more, isn't there? More places that need, whatever it is I do, more darkness that needs light. You need rest. I'll rest when the sun sets." He looked at her with eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. "And when it rises, I'll burn again. Because that's what I am. That's all I am." The captain had no answer to that. What do you say to a sun that insists on shining? They sent him forward, deeper into the Imperium, toward threats that even Astartes' chapters avoided, toward his fate, whatever that meant for something that refused to acknowledge endings. Behind them, the Zythera debris field slowly collapsed inward, atoms remembering how to cohere dust, remembering it had once been a world. But the memory was wrong, fractured as if the planet couldn't quite remember what shape it used to be. At the center of the field, unnoticed by any sensor, a single mote of light flickered. It might have been a reflection. It might have been a star impossibly far away. Or it might have been something else entirely, a promise or a warning, or both at once. The light pulsed once, twice, then faded. But it didn't go out. Light never really does. Solar faith. The distress signal lasted 3 seconds. Forge world Helios, warp breach, demon incursion. Then silence. Inquisitor Covenant watched the coordinates blink like a dying star. Helios 17 billion souls, half the sector's plasma weapons. Lost. Every sensor went dark. When they returned, a new signature had appeared. The same thermal output that had destroyed Helgra, Valentis, Zethera. "He's going there," Covenant said quietly. His officer looked up. "Should we follow at maximum distance and pray we arrive after the burning stops?" Forge world. Helios burned with impossible colors. The warp rift gaped 3 kilometers wide above Cathedral Forge Magnus vomiting demons. Tech priest Dominus Archmagos Vex 9 watched his world's defenses crumble. Skitari legions fired into the demon masses. For every daemon banished 3 manifested. The Omnissiah was silent. A demon prince of Ziench descended 9 eyes, 12 arms, 3 heads speaking in unison. Its form shifted between states' wings, existing in superposition until observed. "Your faith is obsolete." Code. Cathedral Forge's plasma reactor detonated the explosion, spreading slow and beautiful and wrong physics, submitting requests for clarification. Vex 9 calculated survival 0.003%. The sky opened a second time. Light, pure, golden, aggressive, fell like a thrown spear. Impact. The shockwave flattened everything within 500 meters. A figure stood at crater's center, human-shaped. Unremarkable, except for the heat shimmer the way gravity bent. How ground beneath its feet had become something new. Escanor looked at the warp rift, the demon horde, the desperate defenders. He sighed. The sound carried across the battlefield, somehow audible above chaos. He took a step toward the nearest tech priests huddled behind a collapsed wall. They scrambled backward. One raised a las pistol with shaking hands. Escanor stopped, palms raised. "I'm not your enemy." A senior Magos pushed forward, optical sensors focusing and refocusing. "Identify yourself." "I'm here because light still needs to reach this place." Temperature rose, not threatening, just present, warm against demon-chilled air. The Magos' sensors screamed. Thermal output stellar adjacent. Warp presence null. Null. Nothing from the warp touched this being. Demons recoiled from the bubble of pure reality around him. The Magos processed through theological subroutines unchanged since the age of strife. Conclusion arrived with divine weight. "You are the Omnissiah's avatar. The machine God sent you." Escanor's expression shifted to something like pain. "No, I'm just someone who happens to be where the sun shines." But the Magos dropped to their knees, then the others, mechadendrites spreading in supplication vox grills chanting, "Praise the Omnissia, praise the Avatar who stands in steel and fire." Escanor closed his eyes. "Please don't. I'm not what you think I am." Faith once ignited burns hotter than any forge. The demon prince observed with curiosity. 9 eyes focused independently, watching Escanor across multiple futures. In 6, the human died. In 3, he fled. In 1, he joined chaos. But one future flickered where the sun carrier burned bright enough to threaten manifestation. You reject worship, yet they worship anyway. Escanor tried lifting the tech priests to their feet. They wouldn't rise. They'd found their miracle. The demon prince laughed. "Faith is always betrayal of self." Magic lashed out pure change. Tech priests shrieked as augmetics began rewriting themselves, blessed machinery becoming blasphemy. Escanor moved between the wave and the prostrate priests. Magic struck him. Reality tried rewriting itself around his existence. the magic scattered like light through prisms, harmless rainbows drifting away. "I can't be changed," he said quietly. "I've already been transformed as much as anyone should be." The demon prince gestured. Lesser demons poured forth pink horrors, cackling, blue horrors, screaming binary flamers burning with change fire. "Omnissiah," the Magos whispered, "protect your servants." "I told you, I'm not—" Flamers unleashed change fire, not to kill, to transform. Escanor raised his hand. Temperature spiked, suddenly, terribly. Change fire hit an invisible wall of heat and dissipated. Ground beneath his feet began glowing, cherry red, orange, white hot. Anything entering that circle stopped being complex enough for transformation. Demons combusted, simple thermal death. The Magos stared. "You are the sun incarnate. The light chaos cannot corrupt. Please stop. We will build monuments, encode your scripture." Memory surfaced, her voice, "Escanor, if they worship you, you become responsible for their faith. Can you carry that?" The Magos was already broadcasting. "The Omnissiah walks, the Avatar has come." Escanor felt its weight of expectation, faith being forcibly applied. The demon prince laughed. "Faith corrupts even without my touch." Escanor looked up. "You're right, they won't stop." The demon preened. "So I'll destroy the cage before it finishes forming." Temperature began rising in earnest. Tech priests scattered as ground liquefied. "What are you doing?" the Magos shouted. "We are your faithful. You're in danger. If you stay close, you'll burn. That's what I do." Sun was hours from zenith. Body hadn't transformed. But there was another way if you were willing to pay. He reached inward past exhaustion, past natural limits to where true power slept. Pain was just the body saying you were alive. Escanor began converting life force into energy, the one ultimate, no name. Just technique invented fighting the Demon King, burning himself as fuel for impossible light. Skin cracked, golden light seeping through, hair ignited into flame, human shape blurred at edges. The demon prince stopped laughing. "You would self-immolate." "Not for them, for what they represent. If I let them build religion around me, I become another tyrant wearing light." Form expanded. Taller, broader muscles developing through will over biology. Heat intensified until air caught fire. This wasn't Noon's blessing. This was sun-captured, concentrated, forced into space too small. Demon Prince lashed out with reality-warping magic. Escanor swung Rita white-hot, more energy than matter, and split the magic. "You tried teaching me faith corrupts. I learned that long ago." Each footfall left melted craters. The problem isn't faith. It's when faith replaces thinking. Another step. Demon Prince retreated, nine eyes widening. "So I'll give them something they can't worship, something too bright to look at." Escanor raised Rita above his head. The axe emitted light in impossible spectrums. "I'll give them the sun itself." He brought it down. Solar collapse. Compress stellar energy into a point smaller than an atom. Release it all at once. The Demon Prince tried fleeing. Opened a warp portal. The portal caught fire. Space between dimensions burning like paper introduced diffusion. The demon screamed in 9 voices as light touched it. Not holy fire, just heat, pure and absolute. Its form dispersed, evaporated essence scattered across thermal states. Reassembly would take centuries. Light didn't stop. Expanded outward in perfect sphere, consuming demon's wreckage atmosphere. The warp rift tried staying open. Heat was more fundamental than magic. The rift sealed space-time, cauterizing. Cathedral Forge began melting. Not the enemy's doing. Escanor's. Holy forges standing 10,000 years transitioned from solid to liquid to gas. Tech priests fled. Servitors evacuated. Skitarii abandoned posts. At the center, Escanor stood, body now more light than matter, watching his power destroy those he'd come to save. "I'm sorry, but this is what happens when you worship the sun." His form blurred further. Boundary between Escanor and light became irrelevant. He dispersed, spreading like dawn, becoming phenomenon rather than person. Last coherent thought, she would have found a better way. "But I only know how to burn, then light. expanding across Helios like second sun being born at ground level. Inquisitor Covenant's battle barge arrived 3 hours after the light ended, Helios transformed. Northern Hemisphere scoured clean, not destroyed but simplified, reduced to base elements, gleaming like polished glass. Forge temples gone. 17 billion evacuated to orbit just in time. At Devastation's center, something orbited a sphere of golden light 3 meters diameter, rotating slowly, emitting heat that screamed warnings from 3,000 kilometers away. "What is that?" his sensor officer asked. Covenant stared at the pulsing sphere. "What remains when a man becomes a sun?" The sphere pulsed, and augurs registered something impossible, a voice carried on electromagnetic radiation patterns of light translating to language. "Faith does not need proof." Words broken, scattered across wavelengths human ears couldn't hear, but meaning clear. Light does not need names. Silence. The sphere continued orbiting, neither growing nor diminishing. Covenant opened a channel. "This is Inquisitor Covenant, declaring Helios orbit restricted zone, no approach within 10,000 kilometers. On what grounds?" Covenant watched the sphere pulse with light that had been a man who refused worship, and therefore destroyed himself rather than accept divinity. "We witnessed a miracle nobody should see twice." Mechanicus Archive 017, classification. Hereticus Majoris, Helios Prime, total infrastructure loss, population preserved, anomaly solar fragment, Alpha 1 diameter 3.2 meters, core temperature 15.7 million degrees. Kelvin warp signature, Null decay rate, 0 stability, indefinite, object maintains perfect orbit. Approach within 1,000 kilo results in catastrophic thermal failure. DNA traces confirm human origin. Entity's final transmission suggests consciousness and intent rejection of worship, assertion that light requires no validation. Recommendation, absolute information quarantine. Precedent of human rejecting divinity while demonstrating godlike power undermines doctrinal pillars. During evacuation, recovered testimony. He died to save us from ourselves. Praise the omniscient, praise the machine god, praise the sun that would not be praised. 3 months later, a young engine seer returned to Helios orbit. Forge temples rose again on the southern hemisphere, but the north remained untouched, glassed memorial to the day. Faith tried caging light. The engine seer stood at viewport watching solar fragment make its eternal circuit. They held a data slate showing final liturgical code from that day. The Magos had wanted making it scripture. The engine seer refused. He said no, so we shouldn't. Now alone they whispered to the sphere, "I understand now. You saved us from becoming what we feared, from building another god when we had too many." The sphere pulsed. For just a moment the light felt warmer. "Thank you for showing us light doesn't need our permission to exist." They deleted the liturgical code. Every line, every prayer, every attempt to capture what asked not to be captured. Screen went dark. In the void, solar fragment continued orbiting, burning without fuel, shining without purpose, existing simply because existence was what it was. No temples built, no prayers spoken, no monuments erected, just light continuing, the way it always had, the way it always would. Regardless, light than matter watching his power destroy the very people he'd come to save. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though his voice was now too distorted by a heat shimmer to carry properly. "I'm so sorry. But this is what happens when you worship the sun." His form began to blur, further coherence failing. The boundary between Escanor and the light he was generating became negotiable, then irrelevant. He was dispersing, spreading out like dawn breaking, becoming less a person and more a phenomenon. His last coherent thought before consciousness dissolved into pure energy. She would have found a better way. She always did. But I only know how to burn. Then light. Just light, expanding across Forge World Helios like a second sun being born at ground level. Inquisitor Covenant's battle barge arrived 3 hours after the light show ended. They found Helios transformed. The northern hemisphere had been scoured clean, not destroyed but simplified, reduced to base elements that gleamed under the system's sun like freshly polished glass. The forge temples were gone. The manufactorums were gone. 17 billion people had evacuated to orbit just in time. And at the center of the devastation, something orbited in a perfect circle. A sphere of golden light, perhaps 3 meters in diameter, rotating slowly and emitting heat that made their sensors scream warnings from 3,000 kilometers away. "What is that?" Covenant's sensor officer asked, though the fear in their voice suggested they already knew. Covenant stared at the sphere, watching it pulse like a heartbeat, and felt something that might have been awe or might have been horror. Possibly both. "That," he said slowly, "is what remains when a man decides to become a sun." The sphere pulsed again, brighter this time, and Covenant's auger screens registered something impossible. A voice carried not on vox, but on electromagnetic radiation, speaking in patterns of light and heat that translated to something approaching language. "Faith does not need proof." The words were broken, barely comprehensible, scattered across wavelengths that human ears were never meant to hear, but the meaning was clear enough. Light does not need names. Then silence. The sphere continued its orbit, neither growing nor diminishing, locked in some kind of equilibrium between existence and dissolution. Covenant opened a channel to Mechanicus High Command. "This is Inquisitor Covenant Authorization Omega 77. I am declaring Helios orbit a restricted zone effective immediately. No approach within 10,000 kilometers without inquisitorial clearance." "On what grounds?" the response crackled back. Covenant looked at the sphere, watching it pulse with light that had once been a man who'd refused to be worshipped and therefore had to destroy himself rather than accept divinity. "On the grounds that we just witnessed a miracle that nobody should ever see twice." Mechanicus Archive 017, encryption level, terminus, classification, Hereticus Majoris, access, fabricator general, only penalty for unauthorized access, immediate execution, no appeal. Helios Prime, total, forge infrastructure loss, population evacuated successfully, 17 billion souls preserved through emergency protocols. Anomaly designation, solar fragment Alpha 1, physical properties, diameter 3.2 meters, core temperature 15.7 million degrees, Kelvin emissions, all electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously, warp signature, Enol decay rate, 0, projected stability, indefinite, object maintains perfect orbit around planetary center of mass. Attempts to approach within 1,000 km result in catastrophic thermal failure of all ship systems. Probes experience total atomic disassociation at 500 km. Analysis suggests object is not a weapon or device, but a consciousness maintaining coherence through pure thermal energy. DNA traces in surrounding debris field confirm human origin. Theological implications. Catastrophic. The being designated Saint Solar, or Escanor, has transitioned from biological to energetic state. Whether this constitutes death apotheosis or something outside current classification parameters remains unclear. Entity's final transmission suggests awareness and intent rejection of worship assertion that light requires no validation. Recommendation. Absolute information quarantine. Under no circumstances should this event be integrated into imperial cult theology. The precedent of a human rejecting divinity while simultaneously demonstrating godlike power undermines too many doctrinal pillars. Alternative recommendation. Strategic deployment consideration. If consciousness can be communicated with entity represents unprecedented weapon against warp incursions. Solar fragment demonstrates absolute demon exclusion within thermal radius. Final note. During evacuation recovered tech priest testimony includes repeated phrase, "He died to save us from ourselves." Whether himself is grammatically correct or whether they meant something deeper remains subject of theological debate. Investigation ongoing. Further updates is warranted. Praise the Omnissiah. Praise the machine god. Praise the son that would not be praised. 3 months later, a young engine seer, the same one who'd pointed a last pistol at Escanor with shaking hands, returned to Helios orbit. They'd rebuilt the basic infrastructure on the southern hemisphere. Forge temples rising again, manufactorums humming back to life. The Mechanicus was nothing if not persistent. But the northern hemisphere remained untouched, a glassed memorial to the day Faith tried to build a cage around light. The engine seer stood at a viewport on the orbital station, watching the solar fragment make its eternal circuit. They held a data slate at screen showing the final liturgical code they'd managed to preserve from that day. The Magos had wanted to make it scripture, to encode Escanor's words as divine mandate, to build a temple around his rejection of temples. The engine seer had refused, had argued in fact until their superior threatened to have their augmetics removed for insubordination. He said no, the engine seer had told them. He said don't worship him. So, we shouldn't. Now, alone in the dark, they whispered to the sphere that might or might not still contain a consciousness. I understand now. You didn't save us from the demons. You saved us from becoming what we feared, from building another god when we already had too many. The sphere pulsed, and for just a moment, perhaps imagination. Perhaps not, the light felt warmer. Not threatening, just present. Thank you, the engine seer said, for showing us that light doesn't need our permission to exist. They deleted the liturgical code from their data slate. Every line, every encoded prayer, every attempt to capture something that had explicitly asked not to be captured. The screen went dark. In the void, the solar fragment continued its orbit, burning without fuel, shining without purpose, existing simply because existence was what it was. No temples were built, no prayers were spoken, no monuments erected. Just light continuing, the way it always had, the way it always would, regardless. The golden duel. The solar fragment drifted for months. Through the warp, no, not through it. Alongside it, wrapped in a bubble of reality so absolute that the Imperium couldn't touch it. Navigation became impossible near the sphere. Geller fields failed. Warp routes twisted away like water from oil. It moved with purpose, though, slowly, inexorably, toward the heart of the Imperium, toward Terra. Navigator Kelia Voss was the first to notice. She stood in her sanctum aboard the trading vessel Merchant's Hope Third Eye, open and bleeding from the strain of perceiving the Astronomicon. The Emperor's light guided all of humanity through the warp, a beacon that had burned for 10,000 years, unwavering, eternal. Except now, something was wrong. The light flickered, not diminished, not corrupted, just interrupted. As if something had passed between Terra and her ship, casting a shadow where shadows couldn't exist. She blinked all 3 eyes and looked again. There. A point of light moving through real space toward Sol system. Wrong color, not the cold brilliance of the Astronomicon, but warm, golden, like dawn breaking over a world that had forgotten what dawn looked like. Kalia reached for the Vox with shaking hands. Captain, we have a situation. By the time her message reached Terra through the bureaucratic channels, 3 more navigators had reported the same phenomenon. Then 7. Then 23. Something was coming home. Lord Commander Robute Gilliman stood in the Sanctum Imperialis reviewing casualty reports from the Indomitus Crusade when the alarm klaxon sounded. Not the standard alert tones. The old ones' protocols written in the days when the Emperor still walked. When threats approached Terra itself, his equerry burst through the doors, face pale despite decades of conditioning. My lord, the Astronomicon, it's being obscured. Gilliman was already moving his Primarch reflexes, carrying him through corridors at speeds that made mortal guards scramble aside. He reached the observation deck in seconds, looking out at Terra's orbital space through armored viewing ports. Nothing. Empty space. Stars. Where? he demanded. Approaching from galactic north, 18 hours out at current velocity. The equerry brought up tactical displays. Every augury returns contradictory data. Mass signature reads as negligible. Thermal output suggests stellar core. Warp presence null. Gilliman's enhanced mind processed implications faster than baseline humans could speak. Show me the trajectory. The hololithic display painted a line through space, straight toward Mars. No, not Mars. Through Mars's orbital path toward its heading for Sol itself, Gilliman said quietly. My lord, the High Lord's request, I know what they request. Gilliman turned from the viewport. They want it destroyed. Exterminatus protocols, cyclonic torpedoes, whatever removes the threat. My lord, tell them no. Gilliman's voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of authority. If this were a weapon, we'd already be dead. This is something else. What, my lord? Gilliman remembered reports from the past months. Helgra, Valentis, Zithera, Helios, a pattern of light and destruction following no logic except its own. The Inquisition had called it Saint Solar. The Mechanicus whispered about the Omnissiah's avatar. This, Gilliman said, is a question that requires answering. Prepare the Macraga's honor and bring me my armor. You're going to meet it personally. Gilliman looked at the tactical display at the sphere of light that moved with the patience of celestial mechanics toward humanity's cradle. Something that can survive the warp naked and cast shadows on the Astronomicon, yes. I'll meet it. His expression hardened, and if it threatens Terra, I'll end it. They met in the void between Mars and Sol. Gilliman stood on an observation platform extending from his flagship mag-locked boots, the only thing preventing him from drifting into space. Void-sealed armor, the Emperor's sword at his hip, shields at full power, unnecessary precautions perhaps, but he hadn't survived 10 millennia by taking unnecessary risks. The solar fragment approached slowing as it neared. 3 meters of golden light pulsing like a heartbeat radiating heat that made the platform's metal groan even at a kilometer's distance. Gilliman watched it through augmented vision, seeing layers of data his Primarch mind processed automatically. The sphere held no weapons, no armor, just light, compressed to impossible density, held together by something that wasn't magic but wasn't physics either. The sphere stopped precisely 1 kilometer away. For a long moment, nothing happened. 2 entities of power suspended in the void regarding each other across the empty dark. Then the light pulsed, and Gilliman's vox crackled with a voice that shouldn't exist, electromagnetic radiation converted to sound patterns of heat translated to speech. You are Lord Commander. The words came slowly, separated by long pauses, as if the speaker was remembering how language worked. I am Roboot Gilliman Regent of the Imperium, son of the Emperor. His voice carried authority that had commanded star systems. Identify yourself. I was Escanor. Was, past tense. Gilliman noted that. What are you now? A longer pause. The sphere pulsed, brightness fluctuating. Consequence. Behind Gilliman, servitors monitored readings, calculating threat levels, preparing targeting solutions. His hand didn't move toward his sword, but every enhanced muscle was coiled ready. You've destroyed 4 worlds in as many months. Helgra, Valentis, Zithera, Helios. Each name spoken with measured precision. 17 billion dead on Helgra alone. 17 billion saved on Valentis. Through methods that reduced a forge world to glass. The Mechanicus calls you Avatar. The Inquisition calls you Threat. I call you Anomaly. Gilliman took a step forward, mag boots clanking against metal. And anomalies approaching Terra get one chance to explain before I remove them. The sphere's light intensified. Heat washed over the platform's servitors, shutting down as circuits overloaded. Gilliman felt it through his armor, not painful, just present, like standing near a forge, no like standing near a star. I did not choose to come here. Then why are you here? Because light goes where it must. Gilliman's patience, vast as it was, had limits. That's not an answer. It is, the only answer I have, the Lord Commander considered. This Escanor, or whatever remained of him, wasn't behaving like a threat, wasn't demanding worship or surrender, wasn't attacking, just existing, moving with the inevitability of orbital mechanics towards Saul. The High Lords want you destroyed, Gilliman said flatly. They see a weapon approaching Terra. They see demons banished and worlds burned. They don't care about intentions, only results. And you... Interesting question. What did he see? Gilliman thought of Monarchia, of Nuceria, of all the worlds that had burned during the Great Crusade because the Emperor demanded compliance. Results over intentions. Unity through force. He'd spent 10,000 years in stasis questioning that logic, waking to find the Imperium fractured, corrupt, drowning in the very darkness his father had tried to prevent. I see, Gilliman said slowly. Something that burns without asking permission. That saves and destroys in equal measure. That refused worship on Helios and chose to die rather than accept divinity. A pulse. Acknowledgement, perhaps. But I also see a threat. Uncontrolled, uncontrollable. His hand moved to the Emperor's sword fingers, closing around the grip. And I can't allow threats to reach Terra, not while I still draw breath. Then we understand each other. The sphere drifted closer. 500 meters. Temperature spiked. Gilliman's armor registered warnings, cooling systems straining. Stop. The command absolute. The sphere stopped. I protect your home. I cannot blame you but for that. But you won't turn away. I cannot. The sun does not choose its orbit. Gilliman drew the Emperor's sword. The blade ignited, wreathed in golden flame, his father's power channeled through 10,000 years of faith and desperate prayer, the most holy weapon in the Imperium. Then I have no choice. No, you do not. Neither moved for 3 heartbeats. Then both moved at once. The duel that followed would be recorded in 17 different accounts, each contradicting the others. Some claimed Gilliman charged across the void mag boots, carrying him faster than any mortal could track. Others swore the solar fragment surged forward, expanding like a nova. The truth was simpler, and stranger reality bent. Space between them compressed, folding in on itself, 2 points of power collapsing into proximity, not through movement, but through will, asserting dominance over distance. Gilliman swung the Emperor's sword. Holy fire met stellar heat in a collision that registered on sensors across the system. The blade, forged from faith and desperation and 10 millennia of prayer, bit into the sphere's surface. Light scattered. Not cut, scattered like a beam through a prism, breaking into component wavelengths that painted the void in colors that shouldn't exist. The sphere pulsed and heat became kinetic force. Gilliman flew backward, mag boots tearing free his Primarch body, tumbling through vacuum until thrusters fired, stabilizing him. He looked at his sword. The blade had survived, but barely. The molecular structure destabilized reality, having briefly forgotten why metal should stay metal. Impressive, Gilliman said, activating his vox so the sphere could hear. Few things can damage this blade. I am sorry. Sorry. The word caught Gilliman off guard, not defiant, not triumphant, just sorry. Don't apologize, fight or withdraw. I cannot do either. The sphere pulsed again, and suddenly it was next to him, not moved, just relocated, as if the space between points was optional. Heat washed over Gilliman's armor sealant, compounds beginning to boil. He swung again. Reflexes honed through 10,000 years of war. The blade carved a path through light, and for a moment, just a moment, the sphere's surface solidified into something resembling flesh. Copper hair, blue eyes, the ghost of a man's face looking at him with infinite weariness. I was trying to go somewhere safe. Nothing is safe here, Gilliman said, pressing the attack. This is the Imperium. We killed safety 10 millennia ago. Then let me show you what safety hut looked like. The sphere expanded, not attacking, enveloping. Gilliman found himself inside it, surrounded by light that should have incinerated him. His armor screamed warnings. His enhanced biology shut down pain receptors to prevent neural overload. But he didn't burn. Instead, he saw. Memory, not his, someone else's, bleeding through the light. A tavern, small, warm, nothing remarkable except the people inside. 7 of them laughing, drinking, alive. A green-haired woman with eyes like stars. A silver-haired boy who smiled despite scars. A giant with red hair and impossible strength. And a man, copper-haired, unremarkable, holding a stein too large for him, laughing at a joke Gilliman couldn't hear, looking at the green-haired woman with an expression that held no calculation, no agenda, no duty. Just love, simple and doomed and human. The memory shifted. A battlefield. The same man, but different, taller, burning, standing between his friends and a darkness that wanted to consume them. Not out of duty or orders, just because they were his and darkness had no right to them. Another shift. The man sitting alone on a hill watching sunset, crying silently. Not from pain, but from the weight of being 2 people in one body, the strong and the weak, the prideful and the humble, the sun and the shadow. Gilliman felt it, the terrible loneliness of being worshipped for what you were at your strongest and pitied for what you were at your weakest, and loved for neither. The memory fractured. Gilliman fell back into real space, back into his armor, back into the void. The sphere had contracted again, 3 meters, pulsing, waiting. That was safety, a place where strength was not the only virtue. Gilliman steadied himself, checking his armor's integrity. 72%, dropping, but he could still fight. The Imperium has no room for safety, only survival. I know, that is why I should not be here. Then leave. I tried. The warp will not have me. Real space pulls me towards suns. I am trapped in a universe that wants neither light nor shadow, just endless gray. For the first time, Gilliman hesitated. This being wasn't invading. It was lost. Drifting through hostile space, unable to die, unable to stop, pulled by gravity toward the one place where its presence would cause the most catastrophe. Sol cannot harbor you, Gilliman said, and meant it. Your presence would destabilize the system. The Astronomicon would fail. Terra would freeze. Billions dead. No. But you can't leave. No. Gilliman calculated options. None good. Destroy the sphere possible with enough firepower, but the explosion would sterilize half the system. Contain it impossible. Nothing could hold stellar matter indefinitely. Redirect it where every inhabited system would face the same problem. Unless. What if, Gilliman said slowly, you went somewhere that needed light? Somewhere already dead? Explain. The Eye of Terror. The largest warp rift in the galaxy. A wound that bleeds demons and madness. Gilliman sheathed his sword, the gesture deliberate. A place where light doesn't just fail, it's actively murdered. Every day. Silence. The sphere pulsed, rhythm changing. Considering. You would send me into hell to be your lighthouse. I would give you a purpose that doesn't end in Terra's destruction. You want safety. There is none. You want meaning. Fight the darkness where it lives. Burn at the eye's edge, and let every ship in 100 sectors navigate by your light. I would die slowly. You're dying now, just without purpose. A longer pause. The sphere dimmed slightly as if tired. She would have liked that solution. Practical, efficient, kind, despite itself. Someone who understood that light serves best when it illuminates paths, not thrones. Gilliman understood. He'd known someone like that once, before Monarchia, before betrayal, before everything went wrong. I can't promise you'll find her again, Gilliman said quietly. Whatever happens after we die, whatever the Emperor knows he hasn't shared, but I can promise you'll matter. That every navigator who follows your light will survive because of it. That is not worship. No, it's use. And sometimes being useful is the only dignity we can find. The sphere hung motionless in the void. Inside it, what remained of Escanor made a decision: send me. They moved the solar fragment carefully. Fleet Command assigned 12 ships, all automated, no crew, to provide gravitational nudges, steering the sphere away from Sol toward the Eye of Terror. 1,000-year journey at sublight speeds. Gilliman watched from the Macra Gazonner as the sphere began its long drift toward the galactic edge, toward the wound where demons screamed and reality died. My lord, his equerry asked, do you believe it will hold, that the sphere won't deteriorate? No, Gilliman said honestly. I think it will burn out eventually, maybe in a century, maybe a millennium, but until then every ship lost in the Eye's shadow will have a chance. And after it dies, Gilliman thought about that, about a man who'd carried the sun's power and found only loneliness in it, who'd died rather than be worshipped, who'd agreed to an eternity of slow dissolution just to spare Terra the collateral damage of his existence. After, Gilliman smiled, small and sad. After we'll remember that once briefly the darkness blinked first. Navigator's Codex Edition 997 M41 Revised Addendum, The Soul Anomaly. Navigators approaching the Eye of Terror are advised to calibrate secondary instruments to stellar thermal wavelength 5.896 or 1014 Hz. A stable light source exists at coordinates redacted luminosity equivalent to a yellow dwarf spectrum, impossible persistence unexplained. This light does not originate from the Astronomicon, origin unknown. Function navigational beacon for Cadia approach vectors. Local legend calls it the Last Dawn. Use is permitted. Worship is forbidden by inquisitorial decree. Navigate by it. Do not pray to it. Do not name ships after it. Do not ask questions. The light does not answer. It only illuminates. 1 century later, a navigator named Senna guided her ship through the Eye's edge using the strange warm light as reference. The Astronomicon had flickered. Geller fields were failing. Crew was praying. But the light held steady. She pressed her third eye against the viewing port and whispered the prayer her mentor had taught her, not to the light, but to whoever had placed it there. Thank you for burning where no one can worship you. The light pulsed once, warmer somehow, then steady again as it had been for 100 years, as it would be for 100 more, until there was nothing left to burn, just light, continuing regardless.